Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. They Always Talk, written by Teleros. Senior Investigator Second Class Zari X. Valdine turned away from the monitor in disgust. The person inside was lying, as she always did, stretched out on a small bed, and from what X. Valdine had managed to determine, seemed as calm as self-possessed as if she'd been in her own home rather than 16 floors below the surface, inside one of the Yuleton Republic's most secure prisons. 2 days of isolation without food or water had done nothing to weaken her psychological defenses, and her gene-modded physiology had shrugged off every drug that they'd tried. Even alcohol hadn't had any effects, and if the scientists were right about the way her brain worked, the prison supply of nerve agent were worse than useless. It was a miracle that she'd been captured with so few deaths, he knew. Zari, we can't just starve her out. She might start eating the bedding or something, or get really desperate. I can't believe that she showed us all her tricks. Ixvaldine focused his rear set of eyes on the speaker, a colleague in the landing city social stability service, Semla Extor. That was a name, he recalled. New to the service, and with all the naivete that implied, but smart and a quick learner. Dark blue scales and lime green highlights, typical of the people of that country, and a hood that, when extended, showed off a brilliant network of silver and gold circuitry designs. Typical showy young female, he thought to himself as he considered her words. I don't know about the last bit, he said at last, his forward eyes darting back to the cell feed. But you are right, that we can't just let her wither away. I want to see justice done for all those people she killed, and the Ministry of System Security wants to know as much as they can about her technology too. More to the point, she might be an alien criminal, but she still has rights. Semla rubbed her scales and her snout idly. Well, what about the other aliens? Might they be able to help? This kind of thing is why they left the beacon here after all. Convincing the Ministry of Alien Affairs to authorize use of the beacon took the better part of a day. But Ixvaldine knew the thought of their prisoner breaking out or dying was the only thing preventing them from taking an order of magnitude longer. After all, his people had settled on Yuleton 2 to escape the troubles of the rest of the galaxy, and inviting them in was not something anyone was particularly comfortable with. The decision had been made to feed the prisoner, though, and it was with some relief that they noted that she was able to eat Astroni food without any apparent ill effects. The one time that they tried sending in someone to interrogate her, though, she tried to jump him in spite of her arm and leg restraints, and only the, so far, rigid brace around her neck had kept her away. The sheer speed that she moved had been horrifying. 4 days passed before the Ministry of Alien Affairs reported that a ship had arrived in orbit. It was a small thing, as a starship went, and clearly built for atmospheric flight, as the 2 large wings indicated. A long, pointed body was studded with maneuvering thrusters and 2 big nozzles at the back, and Ixvaldine listened with rising tension as the ship, barely 30 meters long, began its descent into the atmosphere. As the chief investigator on this case, he'd been ordered, really, to meet whoever was aboard the ship, and so it kept to an impossibly sudden stop at the nearest government airfield. Ixvaldine emerged from the main terminal building with a dozen soldiers following carefully behind, the 12-foot body snaking along close to the ground. The entire starship lifted itself 3 meters off the ground as legs extended from the undercarriage and pushed its bulk up into the air. Ixvaldine felt the soldiers around him stiffen at the sight, but forced himself to keep slithering forward, arms at his sides and far away from anything that might be perceived as a weapon. After a few moments, a ramp descended from the base of the starship, and shortly after, an alien, another biped, descended. It was a male this time. Ixvaldine knew that at once, taller than the prisoner, bulkier, and it walked differently too. Its clothing was also very different, and he couldn't suppress a shiver at all the black uniform it wore. A single pair of cold, dark eyes looked out from under a peaked cap, emblazoned with a silver alien symbol in the front. A vertical line with a shorter, angled one coming up off the top of one side. The male had an holster of some kind by his hip, and in his other hand he was holding what looked like a briefcase. Its pale skin seemed even paler, set against this ominous, there was no other word for it, uniform. He put good money on the male being the same species as the prisoner too. "You can call me Alvin Holland. I am from Section 1. I understand that you have Mrs. Lucy Wu in your custody." The words came out in perfect Yoltan or Storish, though Ixvaldine could hear the alien's own words barely audible, underneath whatever translating device was in play. "My name is Zol Ixvaldine. I'm in charge of this case. I'm sorry to say that we don't know any of her details, only that she crashed here 8 days ago. We recorded some of what she said, but we can't understand it." "You can fill me in on the way," Holland said, eyes dispassionately surveying the scene. If he seemed bothered by the presence of the soldiers, then Ixvaldine couldn't detect it. "Do you have transport arranged?" The trip back inside the LCSSS car was quiet, the only sound other than the hum of the electric engine and the tires on the road being the recordings of the prisoner being played back at double speed by Holland. There was something deeply unnerving about him, Ixvaldine decided, as he looked over from the seat he curled himself up in. The prisoner, Lucy Wu, had very expressive face, and he'd seen all manner of emotions on it so far. Yet this one seemed, not blank, but indifferent, perhaps. No emotion ever passed across his face as he listened to the recordings. They were only 3/4 of the way there when the final one ended. "Nothing of great value, I'm afraid," said Holland, handing back the audio player. "Most of it just consists of obscene or derogatory language, threats of violence and revenge and the like. The rest of the time she's talking to herself. She was angry with herself at having been caught," he said, noticing Ixvaldine's sudden spike of interest. "After she crashed in this world, can you tell me what she did?" Ixvaldine looped his head a couple times in the Astorani equivalent of gritting its teeth. "Yes, though it pains me to do so. Her starship was a very small one, but it crashed into a rocky valley and was, from what our teams could tell, comparatively ruined by the impact. The valley was near Tash, near the small farming village though, and shortly after our teams arrived on the scene, we found tracks indicating a biped had survived the crash and had headed in that direction. My teams hurried there as best they could, but by the time they had arrived it was too late. She'd snuck into one house and, just killed everyone. She'd taken the father's registered laser rifle as well, and then set the house alight. She must have heard that she was being followed, because when my teams got close, she killed everyone. Didn't waste a single shot. When her rifle ran out of power, she improvised other weapons and killed most of the other people in the village. Luckily, my team's weapons were locked to their genes, so we were eventually able to immobilize her. But, at great cost. She had little difficulty in snapping steel wires in two, and was just so fast that, frankly, we were lucky, Ixvaldine admitted at last. Lucky enough to capture her when she'd only killed 96 people. Holland's face remained impassive throughout the story, but when it came clear that Ixvaldine was finished, he spoke. Yes, that fits the psychological profile. She was an insane person. No, Ixvaldine couldn't help but raise his voice. She slaughtered away through 96 people, none of whom possessed any threat to her before she began her rampage. And you consider that sane? What other species of the galaxy would even consider such a thing? I do not consider that insane, Holland replied. She was almost certainly not thinking particularly rashly, but given who and what she is, her behavior was not unexpected. You are correct in that such behavior is statistically much rarer outside of humanity, however. Well, said Ixvaldine, I hope you're good, because so far she said nothing. I would not worry about that. In the end, they always talk. Lucy Wu heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching her cell, and sat up slowly, giving time for a long metal armature that held her neck brace steady to move with her. It locked in place once she was sitting, however. But she decided this time not to scare her captors, especially if this was someone who could help her get out more easily. The cell door swung open, and Wu felt all hope drain away in an instant as that instantly recognizable black uniform appeared. Paying no attention to her, the man waited until the door cell slammed shut and locked itself, then walked over to the little table in the middle of the room, settled his briefcase down on it, and sat down in one of the chairs. Still, her mind began running through her options. He'd had a holster. That meant a gun, but it was probably locked to his jeans or something. Damn! She'd have to try and talk him around then. Please, release her restraints. Wu felt the locks in her neck brace flip open, along with one that kept her hands and feet restrained. Shrugging out of the thick, reinforced handcuffs, she pulled off the ankle cuffs and neck brace, shaking out her striking red hair. True red, not gene-modded. Thanks, mister. You don't know how pleased I am to see another human around here. My name is Mrs. Lucy Wu, born 1st of July 4412 AD, and wanted in the connection with 4,106 separate incidents involving theft, smuggling, murder, attempted espionage, piracy, assault, child assault, terrorism, attempted genocide, and genocide. On Yulton 2 specifically, you are charged with the murder of 96 people. The man looked directly at her, and in spite of herself, Wu shivered. Those eyes. There was nothing there, just nothing. She should have just cooperated with the snakes. Crap. I see, he said. When it became obvious no answer was forthcoming, the tone of his voice never changed. It was always the same icy, polite monotone, the kind that can make a frozen nitrogen precipitate out of a warm summer sky. I should perhaps point out that whatever the Yastarani natives might think, I am not here to interrogate you, or even to determine your guilt. We both know that you are guilty, Mrs. Wu. My colleagues examined your mind state backups in detail before deleting them all. Yes, including the one held by a certain insurance company on the throne world. We have people and favors owed everywhere, and you were problematic enough to warrant using some of them. Almost too fast to see, Wu began to leap at Holland, but even as her gene-modded muscles began to uncoil, she felt herself stopped, as fiber-optic nerves refused to transmit signals. She drew back an arm to throw a punch, one that, small and light as she was, would have instantly killed even the most heavily armored Astarani on the planet. But once drawn back, her fist refused to budge. Bastard! She hissed, suddenly afraid for the first time in her life. This couldn't be happening yet. Yet it was. Like I said, Mrs. Wu, I know that you are guilty. The man never moved his mouth, but Wu heard the words in her head perfectly, in exactly the same accent. Her eyes became saucers as the implications of what had just happened sank in. As it happens, Mrs. Wu, you have no more backups left. Once I kill you, that'll be it. I will have one more use for your corpse, however, as your husband has so far not listened to any of our messages. But that is all. Ignoring her immobilized form, he stood up and opened the briefcase, revealing about a dozen flat-pack stasis containers, along with a small but powerful and precise force field generator. The kind ideally suited of making sure that she could fit into the stasis containers. I can still cut off my own pain receptors, she managed, sweat pouring down her as the thing. She couldn't think of it as a man anymore. It was too inhumanly calm to be called that. Regarding her curiosity, like an interesting mold growing into a petri dish. Do your worst. The man frowned. I am not in the habit of granting last requests, Mrs. Wu. Besides, I can only afford to spend another 2 hours planetside. However, she felt her head turn and her eyes locked onto his despite her best efforts to look away. I've been doing this job for a very long time, and in this case, I am willing to compromise. Ixvoldine slithered drunkenly away from the call feed, careful to avoid the puddle left by Ixtor. He understood now why the black-clad human had insisted the feeds be cut, but Ixvoldine's superiors had demanded that he at least keep the visual feeds on. But the sound, by all that was just and rational, the sound! The other prisoners in the cells nearest hers were close to rioting, and the staff of the entire floor had fled. as the sanity-destroying sound defeated the soundproofing in the nearest cells, and thus was heard in the control room thanks to their audio feeds with contemptuous ease. The video was bad enough, to see the human male sitting there calmly whilst the female writhed in the floor, but it was the screaming that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. It just went on and on, long after even her alien lungs must have emptied themselves, long after he knew without a shadow of a doubt that her mind, twisted as it had been, was shattered and broken. Still, it went on without respite. The sound stopped, and Ixvaldine shuddered the full length of his body, a hand reaching out and slapping the power button on the visual feeds, just as the black-clad figure on the monitor began to reach for the briefcase. "Thank you for your cooperation in this matter," Holland said as he approached the starship and the ramp dropped down again. A dozen levitating cubes that looked for all the world like mirrors with handles on the tops floated past him and disappeared into the shuttle. "I'm afraid my report is not going to help put this matter to rest in the way it deserves, but I can assure you that Mrs. Wu died in a manner befitting someone of her nature. Justice! What I heard is—" Holland raised a hand. "Zari Ixvaldine, I suggest you forget about this. It is unfortunate that you had to go through what you did, but you are a competent senior investigator, second class, and it would be a suboptimal result for you to dwell on this matter too much. If you will excuse me, I must be off, as I have an important message to deliver to Mr. Wu. Good day." Ixtor waited until the human starship had disappeared before sidling up to Ixvaldine. "What did he mean, sir, about forgetting it?" Ixvaldine watched the sleek winged machine disappear beyond the clouds. "I don't know," he said. "The video feed didn't look very pleasant, but did we get any audio at all?" "No, sir, and, I'm afraid one of the janitors deleted the video when they went in to clear up the mess that I'd made." Ixvaldine glanced over at her. "I doubt it would have told us much." He bobbed his head in an Astarani shrug. "At least it's been dealt with, though. Buy you a drink?" As the planner receded behind him, Alvin Holland settled down to write his report to his own superiors. With any luck, it would be done by the time he arrived at the rendezvous, which would mean that he could get on with delivering Mrs. Wu to her husband and partner in crime. Given Mr. Wu's likely reaction to seeing his wife in her present condition, he might be able to wrap up this case before the end of the year, especially thanks to all the information Lucy Wu had known about her husband's operations. She had had a choice, and in the end, they always talked. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons: Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Parky, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakul, and Arcadian.